Thank you very much, Dr. Miesche, and thank you, Leonard Wallach, for inviting me to be with you for this lecture in this important series. It's a pleasure to be back in beautiful Santa Barbara. My last time on this campus was 38 years ago, just before my first exposure to Africa. I'd just gotten married, and my wife and I were part of a 10-week course at UCLA for Peace Corps recruits, about 150 persons who had been assigned to Ethiopia. Eritrea was part of Ethiopia at that time. And about the third week into training, the course directors decided that it would be a great idea to pack us off for a weekend in Santa Barbara to help us get in touch with our feelings. We were divided into sensitivity groups and encouraged to talk about our real feelings about mom and dad, you know, and somewhat incidentally, our real feelings about going to Ethiopia. The psychologists were in control of this exercise, and they thought they could screen out those trainees who were not very good risks for going to Ethiopia at that time. Of course, none of these guys who were doing the screening had been to Ethiopia, so how did they know? But anyway, we made the cut. And we went to Ethiopia, and frankly, our lives were never the same again. So here's to Santa Barbara and its role in my career. I was asked to lecture on Africa, and this lecture is, of course, part of a series on global forces in the post-Cold War world. So some of you may be asking, is such a lecture worthwhile? After all, President Bush was quoted in the campaign as saying that he didn't really think Africa had much to do with our national interests. So let me mention a few facts to try to put that question into perspective. Perhaps I should hasten to add that once the new administration started, that the new Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, did say that Africa was important, and I'm sure these two had a juxtaposition that's significant. But at any rate, to put into perspective Africa's role in the U.S. and the world and in its relationship to us, 12% of the U.S. population, of course, has its roots in Africa, and immigration flows from Africa have increased sharply in the last 2 decades. Those of you living in California will have noticed that because there are many Africans who've settled in California. The U.S. has considerably more trade with Africa than with the states of the former Soviet Union. That's a fact that's probably not well known. And we get a significant proportion of our oil from Africa, especially Nigeria and Angola. America can be affected by Africa's health problems. Last year, for example, cities on the eastern seaboard, particularly New York, were in a panic about the spread of the deadly West Nile virus, which apparently arrived from Africa in New York via a bird carried on a regularly scheduled airline flight. Interesting connection there. And over the past 10 years, the United States government has spent several $billions of its taxpayers' money providing relief to victims of civil wars in Africa. In my approach tonight, I'll first attempt a brief historical review of the American approaches to Africa since the mid-50s to put the post-Cold War period into perspective. Then I'll look at special issues in American policy toward Africa, and I'll end with some observations on foreign policy implementation in Africa, including the special impact of the Peace Corps. Since the arrival of independent Africa on the world stage in the middle of the last century, it has remained most of the time on the back burner of U.S. foreign policy interests. But there have been bursts of intense interest which have put Africa intermittently into the headlines. Beneath the surface of sporadic media attention, however, there's been a significant evolution of our policy over time. And for convenience, I would draw attention to 3 rough periods. First, the period of decolonization from the mid-50s, let's say the independence of Sudan in 1956, the independence of Ghana in 1957, through the liberation of the former Portuguese colonies in 1975. The second period, rough period, we can talk about after 75, you might call the period of Afro-pessimism, generated by military coups and dictatorships, sharp economic decline, and a particular focus on the racial struggle in southern Africa. And then the third period, the period of the 1990s, the post-Cold War period, during which the Clinton administration, in part for domestic political reasons, tried to put a new face on U.S. policy. So let me try to encapsulate what I see as the major features of U.S. policy during these periods. At the start of decolonization, the U.S. really had very limited contacts with Africa. It did have a kind of de facto protectorate over Liberia, which had been the recipient of a group of former slaves that went back to Africa. It had a diplomatic mission in Ethiopia, which was important in World War II. It had a consulate general in Dakar, Senegal, and a handful of other consulates in other cities around the continent. The U.S. tended to defer to the interests of its allies, the colonial powers in Africa, including Portugal, in large part out of the interest of keeping them all focused on, in the alliance, united against the Soviet Union. The Kennedy period, however, featured a certain romantic excitement about decolonization. And I think a majority of informed Americans identified with that decolonization process because of our own colonial past. And at this time, the United States made a conscious decision to establish embassies in virtually all these countries, even countries with a population of less than 1 million. A key consideration here was not romance or simply identification with the Africans, but competing with the Soviet Union for influence with the new states. The Soviets established an embassy, the Chinese established an embassy, we established an embassy. Peace Corps programs were established in almost all of these countries. And a cadre of foreign service officers in the State Department began to view themselves as African specialists. A third feature is that the fragility of these states manifested themselves almost immediately. The Congo erupted into chaos in 1960 with its independence. Then in 1965-66, there were a rash of coups d'etat around the continent, particularly noteworthy in Ghana and Nigeria. There had been great hopes for Ghana and Nigeria at the beginning of their independence. The East Africa Federation of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda broke up. And then, following the decolonization of the Portuguese colonies in the mid-70s, a civil war broke out in both Mozambique and Angola. So disillusion, or some disillusion, quickly followed on the romance of decolonization. The second period I've indicated was one of American Afro-pessimism. I think Afro-pessimism is a term that was coined in Europe, but it's one which connotes skepticism, tinged with racism at times, about the capacity of the African states to govern themselves and find their way out of poverty. I would say that this period was characterized by a U.S. focus on a few key states, initially Nigeria. It was often said around the State Department during that period that 20% of all Africans are Nigerians, so the country is important, it has oil. But then when drug trafficking in Nigeria sort of took over the headlines and there were increasingly repressive military regimes, cooperation became almost impossible with Nigeria. There was a focus on the Horn of Africa. We had an ally in Emperor Haile Selassie. After he was overthrown very late in his life by a revolutionary Stalinist dictatorship, we were trying to figure out how to regain our footing in that area, and we curiously had an alliance. We concluded an alliance with Somalia, which was not really a very good bet, but in any case, we wanted to have some traction in the Horn of Africa, so Somalia it was. Sudan got a lot of attention, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, because even though the dictator there, Jafar Numeri, had been in power for some time, he lined up behind our new relationship with Egypt under Anwar Sadat. And for 10 years, he actually halted the civil war that had been ravaging Sudan since independence. Another area was Liberia, where the violent overthrow of the minority Americo-Liberian elite in 1980 set off a vigorous U.S. effort to forestall the influence of Colonel Gaddafi. And I remember, since I was assigned to Liberia 1982 to 84, we were very proud of the fact that we had invested more than $250 million in Liberia under Sergeant Doe to try to forestall Gaddafi's influence. However, the primary focus was on southern Africa because there was great concern about trying to bring about a peaceful transfer of power in the colonies, which became Namibia and Zimbabwe, and of course in South Africa, and to minimize Soviet influence in the area. Again, the Soviet theme remained important. During this period of the 80s, we became very heavily involved in emergency relief in Africa. You may recall a drought in Ethiopia, drought in the Sahel. Drought in the Sahel was a little earlier. There were billions of dollars spent on relief for victims of the war in Sudan after 1987, and later high levels of aid to Liberian and Sierra Leonean refugees. So when you look at the foreign disaster account of our foreign assistance, very high levels are going to Africa. Interestingly, in the 80s, there came to be a focus on collaboration with other donors, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, on halting a disastrous economic slide in Africa. When I speak about that slide, I can give you some idea of what it was like if we think that in 1957, when Ghana became independent, the per capita income of Ghana was the same as the per capita income of South Korea. And of course, now there is no comparison between the two because of the growth of those countries of Asia and stagnation in Africa. The economic reform approach which was used included ending government control of prices, government control of trade, balancing the budget, realigning exchange rates, and eventually got into debt reduction rather late. And by the beginning of the 90s, most African states were actually enjoying a positive economic growth on a macro basis. In the 80s, by the end of the 80s, U.S. aid to Africa reached a historic high, U.S. economic aid as opposed to just disaster relief, of about $1.2 billion a year. Going on to the most recent period, I would suggest that the 90s and the beginning of the new millennium mark a third roughly distinguishable period for U.S. foreign policy, identifiable at least initially with the Clinton era. This period has been characterized by a higher level of symbolic U.S. involvement with Africa. This was spurred in part by the influence of domestic politics and the rising power of the Black Caucus in the U.S. Congress. In early 1994, there was the first White House conference on Africa, and Jesse Jackson was made special envoy for African democracy. Clinton himself made a 2-week trip to Africa in 1998, by far the longest ever made by a U.S. president. Undergirding all this was the peaceful transfer of power in South Africa to Nelson Mandela and the African Nationalist Congress government, which caused a lot of optimism at the beginning of the 90s. Of course, there was a darker undercurrent just at this time, and that was the U.S. experience in Somalia, where a number of U.S. troops, a part of the U.S. peacekeeping contingent, were killed in Mogadishu, and their bodies were dragged around in the capital. And thereafter, the Clinton administration, which was badly burned by this event, became so leery of the introduction of any kind of U.S. forces into Africa that it largely stood by when genocide raged in the Great Lakes area and when chaos enveloped the Congo subsequently. Another tragedy the simultaneous terrorist bombings of the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, which killed a number of Americans and hundreds of Africans, probably worked the other way to reinforce U.S. interest in Africa. An insoluble problem for the Clinton presidency, and a major one facing his successor, is the markedly low level of U.S. government resources available for Africa. U.S. economic assistance to Africa has dropped well below $1 billion. It's some 40% lower in real terms than in 1990. And this means, among other things, that there have been virtually no funds available to support African and UN peacekeeping in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the Congo. This lack of resources, I hasten to point out, is very much part of a larger picture of a disastrous decline in resources allocated by the Congress to foreign affairs and foreign operations in general. If we look back over the decades, in the 1960s, 4% of the federal budget was allocated to foreign operations, foreign policy, 2% in the 1980s, and 1% in the 90s. So I'd like to move on from that somewhat crude categorization of historical periods to some of the themes or foci of American involvement in Africa. There are really three that I'd like to talk about. The first is open economies, the second is conflict resolution, and the third is democracy and human rights. In the 1960s, when most African states came to independence, the prevailing economic ideology was African socialism. Get control of the economy if you're the leader of the state. It was in large part a reaction to the perceived exploitation of African populations by the colonial powers and by the companies which belonged to the colonial powers. But African socialism turned out to be disastrous in its application and was responsible in considerable part for the decline of Africa's percentage of world trade from 3% in 1960 to only 1% in 1990. It tended to contribute to bloated government bureaucracies, corruption, and capital flight. Capital flight not only by foreign investors, but by Africans who had resources as well. There were a few exceptions, Botswana, Mauritius, Cote d'Ivoire during the 80s, but African economies in the 70s and 80s were characterized by low levels of domestic and foreign investment, high budget deficits, which meant, in fact, lower and lower levels of funding for public education and for health. Now, by the 1980s, American embassies and USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development missions, got heavily engaged in economic policy dialogue with the governments to which they were accredited. Ambassadors, directors of the aid missions, economic officers in the embassies were understanding instructions to press African government leaders to improve the climate for the private sector, not just for American investors, where they existed, and there weren't too many of them, but also for Africans. USAID missions got heavily into support of small business development, including microcredit. The Peace Corps, which had continued its programs in Africa since the beginning of the 60s, began to increase the focus on small business development programs, which now constitute about 15% of the volunteers in Africa. In Senegal, where I was ambassador from 1996 to 99, I started a task force which included the World Bank and those who were in charge of French aid and the European community, and we developed a set of recommendations for the Senegalese government on removing red tape obstacles to business investment in the country. Many of these obstacles were things like requirements for approvals of licenses, in which the investor had to go in and talk to a particular bureaucrat to get approval of a license or get approval for an incentive. And of course, these had a tendency to lead to expectations of payoffs to government officials and were directly contributing to corruption. The second area is conflict resolution. I think most Americans, or at least many of them, when they think of Africa today, they visualize Africa as a vast stage of civil and cross-border conflict. This view, of course, overlooks peaceful resolution of civil wars during the past decade in places like Mozambique, Mali, South Africa, of course, and in December 2000 of the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But I think the image, this image of conflict is perhaps inevitable, given the news coming out of the Congo, where troops from 6 different African countries have at times been in combat, the Congo situation being called Africa's First World War by outgoing Assistant Secretary of State Susan Rice, or the vicious Sierra Leonean rebels who routinely cut off the arms and legs of civilians, including women and children, or Sudan, where conflict between North and South has continued for all but 10 years of the 45 years since the country became independent. In any case, senior American officials involved with Africa routinely spent and spend today much of their time, whether they're in Washington or they're overseas, trying to help bring peace to these situations of violence. Chester Crocker, who was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the 80s under the Reagan administration, played a key role in the peace agreement that brought Namibia to independence. Jeffrey Davidow, a friend of mine who later became ambassador to Zambia, Venezuela, and Mexico, was an active player in the Lancaster House talks which led to Zimbabwe's independence. More recently, Tony Lake, who was Clinton's first chief of the National Security Council, was the key external actor in the peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was signed last December 12. And if I may speak of my own experience for a moment, I got involved in the late 1980s with the main Southern Sudanese rebel organization when I was assigned to our embassy in Khartoum, Sudan, an embassy which is no longer open. But at any rate, I got involved in conversations with this rebel group, hoping it would mark a first step toward negotiations with the government in Khartoum to lead to the end of the Civil War. Actually, it didn't lead to anything, but it was an interesting experience. In 1995-96, as special presidential envoy for Liberia, I met with differing warring factions in Liberia. These were a great bunch of guys, I can tell you. And I worked with West African leaders like the president of Ghana, the UN and Western donors, the Dutch, the Danes, the British, the French, to press this group of protagonists toward a peaceful settlement. It was hard work, but we did make some progress on that eventually. Later on, as ambassador to Senegal in 1999, civil war erupted in Senegal's southern neighbor, Guinea-Bissau. We closed our embassy down there, pulled out our ambassador and the Peace Corps volunteers and everybody else. But I was able to go down a couple of times to try to persuade the protagonists in that war to give up their personal quarrel in the interests of peace. And I consider that work some of the most significant that I was able to do. Certainly it was very personally satisfying, even if not always a great deal was achieved. The third area of focus is democracy and human rights. I recall quite vividly that near the end of my tour in Liberia in 1984, a veteran senior official from the State Department came out to Liberia to look at the situation there. It wasn't very encouraging, but we had been spending quite a bit of time talking to the Liberians about organizing political parties and having an election. And this official asked 2 or 3 of us in the embassy seriously whether we really thought that democracy in Liberia was in the national interest of the United States. I and my colleagues were appalled, but it was not unreflective of views in the State Department, I would say, in the early part of the 1980s. I can tell you that such a question would be inconceivable now, regardless of whatever the private views of such an official would be. The goal of democracy and human rights is now so embedded in our policy that no no public official would challenge that. So if he or she had some doubts about whether democracy was in the U.S. interest in Liberia, he or she certainly wouldn't share it with anybody else in the embassy. I would give credit to Jimmy Carter, who first made human rights a major thrust of U.S. foreign policy. And by 1985, after this event, even with the Reagan administration, this emphasis on human rights and democracy was enshrined in both law and policy. A consensus had developed by that time that democratization, in particular giving political groups reason to believe they could change the government peacefully rather than going to war, and making government officials feel accountable to the citizenry rather than feeling that they could steal everything they could get their hands on, is important to a variety of U.S. objectives in Africa, including reducing civil conflict, advancing human rights, and promoting economic growth through the private sector. And indeed, there has been quite a bit of progress, which I think has probably gone unnoticed by many Americans over the past decade. There have been a number of fair elections in which the opposition has come to power peacefully. South Africa is perhaps the great example, but others are important as well, such as Benin, Malawi, Zambia, Cape Verde, and most recently in Senegal and Ghana. American ambassadors and political officers have a responsibility, and have had such a responsibility for the last 10 years, to collect information on human rights and political reform and to report to the Department of State for an annual assessment to Congress. Now, if you've been reading the papers, you probably saw some mention of the Human Rights Report. It's just come out, and of course the focus was on China in particular, and Colombia and some other headliners. But this is a process that goes on everywhere we have an embassy. So the collection of information includes not just freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the media, whether newspapers, private newspapers can publish, but in recent years things like women's rights, labor rights, and religious freedom are also reported on to Congress. Ambassadors are frequently instructed to take up with presidents and interior ministers problems of political repression and electoral fraud, and to hold regular discussions on how democracy can be promoted. When I was ambassador to Guinea in the early 90s, my view was that it was the most important U.S. goal to help that country make an orderly transition to democracy. After the dictator Sékou Touré died, it was a military government that took over, and this military government said it wanted to move toward civilian democratic rule. So I thought it was important that we help them. And I brought a team from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a group organized back in Washington with some funding from the U.S. Congress, which includes groups of Republicans and Democrats who work on this overseas. And I brought a team out to Guinea to work with Guinean political parties in preparing for the first elections that took place in 1993. Later on, when I went to Senegal, my first fall there, I angered Senegalese government officials by raising questions about some elections that were held in November 1996, which were clearly were violations of electoral laws and some fraud involved. And I made some calls on people in the party about this, and found myself on the 1st of January summoned by the Prime Minister, no longer the Prime Minister, but by the Prime Minister for a serious lecture on how I was sadly misinformed and I didn't know what I was talking about. But actually, it was a good thing that happened, because indeed the quality of elections improved in Senegal, and I don't take credit for it alone. It was a variety of things. But having people from outside raising questions about it certainly was helpful. And so elections improved in 1998, and then last year, in 2000, in February, the opposition for the first time won the presidency in Senegal in a free and fair election. The president stepped down, new president took over. And it was a great step forward for Senegal. Sometimes I was asked, as the Prime Minister asked me in effect, but I was asked by other people why I should presume as an American to lecture them about elections. They had a lot of pride in the fact that there had been some kind of elections in Senegal since the Third Republic in France. But I always said that, yes, Senegal was one of Africa's most democratic countries, and that was a fact. I wasn't gilding the lily there. But that it was natural for democratic governments to talk with each other about the democratic process. And I always said that democracy is a work in progress, wherever it is found, and that in the U.S. we have a particular problem of financing elections. Now, of course, if I were in Senegal now, I would talk about Florida and our problems there with unequal citizen access to reliable voting technology, which is a problem in the U.S. I want to move now to spend the rest of my time looking at one aspect of foreign policy implementation in Africa. It's a favorite of mine, so I'm imposing it upon you. As you know from my introduction, I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and I'm currently president of the National Peace Corps Association. So I thought it might be interesting for you to hear something about the role of the Peace Corps in Africa and the impact of the Peace Corps alumni on policy implementation as regards Africa. This is the 40th anniversary of the Peace Corps. It was launched in 1961, and the first group of volunteers to go overseas went to Africa. They went to Ghana and arrived in September 1961. Although programs got started in Asia and Latin America at about the same time, there was always special emphasis on Africa. About 50% of the 160,000 or so Americans who have served in the Peace Corps have served in Africa. And even today, while there are new programs in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, more than 40% of Peace Corps volunteers are found in Africa. There have been programs in most African countries, punctuated by occasional evacuations or withdrawals because of security concerns or a sharp deterioration in our bilateral relations. That's what happened in Ethiopia, of course, when the new communist government took over. The Peace Corps left. In the case of Botswana, which at independence was one of Africa's poorest countries and now has one of the highest per capita incomes of about $2,000, the program was eventually phased out as a success, a very successful program. Peace Corps volunteers in Africa are working in education, health, small business development, environmental protection, and agriculture. And my personal observations, which I made traveling around Guinea and traveling around Senegal and meeting with Peace Corps volunteers out in the bush, are that they're at least as effective as my own group of volunteers who served in Ethiopia and Eritrea in the early 1960s. Why does it work? I would submit that John F. Kennedy, who's given credit for starting the Peace Corps, or more precisely, Sergeant Shriver, the founder and first director of the Peace Corps, and his team stumbled on an essential truth. And that truth is that the individual American, highly motivated, trained in the language and culture of a developing country and with certain basic skills in teaching or agriculture or health, can make a difference in development at the local level. Now, of course, it doesn't always work. I mean, some volunteers get very frustrated, they leave early, and a few don't take their job seriously, and it's just like anything else. But most Americans who have entered the Peace Corps found that, although the experience was very difficult initially, that when they got through, they could point to some achievements and developments at their school or at clinics or in their villages where they were working with others. So, for my money, the Peace Corps volunteers are still America's premier grassroots developers in Africa. Now I want to move on to the impact of the Peace Corps on the foreign service in Africa. When the Peace Corps appeared in 1961, it joined a new coterie of foreign affairs agencies. There was the State Department, There was the CIA, there was USAID, the Development Cooperation Agency, which was reorganized under the Kennedy administration, and there was the U.S. Information Agency. And I can tell you that the Peace Corps was regarded with total skepticism by those agencies when it first arrived. But within a short period, former Peace Corps volunteers were, of course, feeding into these agencies, and the perceptions were beginning to change. The State Department had already changed quite a bit from the pre-war days. It changed a great deal in the late 40s and 50s. It had the reputation that it only took people from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, that sort of thing, but it had changed a lot by the 1960s. It better reflected the geographic, educational, and socioeconomic diversity of this country. And what's more, it was increasingly focused on the third world, as it was called then. The developing countries were called. Because embassies opened throughout Asia and the Middle East in the 1950s. They were expanding in Latin America with the Alliance for Progress, and they mushroomed in Africa beginning in 1960. So American Foreign Service officers were increasingly spending their careers outside of Europe and Japan. The Foreign Service was predominantly men in the 1960s because young women, until 1972, were obliged to resign from the Foreign Service if they had the audacity to marry. And that problem wasn't fixed until about 1973. There was also another significant factor in the culture of the Foreign Service at that time. Most of the men who joined the Foreign Service, their previous international background was with the U.S. military. So when I entered the Foreign Service in 1967, most of my older colleagues had served abroad with the military in Europe or Japan, and some of them were veterans of the Korean War, and the older ones were veterans of World War II. That was about to change. The first returnees from the Peace Corps to launch Foreign Service careers arrived in Washington about 1965. And when I turned up in Washington in 1967, there were 15 out of 75 in my group who were returned Peace Corps volunteers. Most of us actually had served in Africa. And since that time, about 10% of Foreign Service officers have had Peace Corps experience. And by the late 1980s, some of these had reached the rank of ambassador. The impact was even stronger in USAID, the Development Cooperation Agency, with the total rising well over 20%. In fact, it was said in the 1980s and 90s that if you were going to become an aid Foreign Service generalist, you basically had to have Peace Corps experience. According to a survey of returned volunteers carried out by the Peace Corps in 1996, 36% of former volunteers were working abroad, of which 7% were working for AID and 3% for the State Department. So what conclusions can we draw about the impact of this service, particularly with reference to Africa? First, insofar as the State Department was concerned, the majority of these Peace Corps alumni were moving into positions in developing countries. And the availability of returned Peace Corps volunteers at the junior and middle grades, at a time when we were opening new embassies around the world, particularly in Africa, had a positive impact on political and economic reporting. There was a much greater awareness of the importance of ethnicity and cultural factors in the politics and economics of the country, and this was reflected in the reporting going back to the State Department. Ex-Peace Corps volunteers also greatly expanded the ranks of those with skills in non-European languages, including important languages in Africa like Arabic, Swahili, Amharic, which is the official language of Ethiopia, Hausa, and Lingala. And when I came back as ambassador to Senegal in 1996, I found that my economic officer and my program officer in AID were both fluent Wolof speakers because they had served as Peace Corps volunteers in Senegal before, Wolof being the most common language in Senegal. So that gave greater quality and depth to those involved in African embassies. And in Africa, this infestation, as I sometimes call it, of Foreign Service ranks with former volunteers also coincided with the development of the Special Self-Help Fund, which were small grants used to fund grassroots development activities, often supervised by current Peace Corps volunteers. These funds were very helpful in getting embassy members out into the countryside and looking at development at the grassroots level. Returned Peace Corps volunteers reaching the higher ranks in the later 80s and 90s and securing positions as deputy chiefs of mission or as ambassadors had, at least according to my somewhat biased observation, had a somewhat special style of operation, different from that of their colleagues, which stressed widespread travel in country, including to remote areas with few tourist services. These people were more likely to establish relations with previously neglected interlocutors like traditional religious leaders or village leaders or small town mayors. They placed less emphasis on relations with the traditional political, economic, and military elites, and therefore, I like to think, had a more in-depth understanding of where the country was going. And I would submit that this leavening of the Foreign Service made it much easier for U.S. diplomacy abroad to adjust to new areas of concentration, such as human rights, concerns about population and the environment, and the importance of the U.S. Direct diplomatic involvement in trying to reach a resolution of internal conflicts. Of course, if you look back, it can be said that in the 50s and 60s, we also took a great interest in civil wars and internal conflicts, as in Vietnam or the Philippines or Cuba or Guatemala. But in those conflicts, we took sides against what we viewed as the wards of Moscow or Beijing. And in subsequent years, we tended to focus more on the process of reconciliation itself and playing the role of facilitator or conciliator rather than trying to make sure that our side won. I've focused a good deal of attention on the impact of returned Peace Corps volunteers on the implementation of U.S. government policy. It's important to note that over time, private contractors have played an increasingly important role in carrying out development and other activities in Africa funded by the U.S. government. Most USAID projects in Africa or anywhere else around the world are today implemented by international private agencies based in the U.S. or by American universities like UCSB or even by for-profit contractors. The survey that I cited above a moment ago indicates that 13% of former Peace Corps volunteer respondents were working with private voluntary organizations doing international work. And I find it true of agencies based in Washington, D.C., clustered near my office, but also the case of organizations based in Boston or New York or Atlanta or Seattle or San Francisco and Los Angeles are just full of returned Peace Corps volunteers. The two largest international non-government organizations, CARE and Catholic Relief Services, are full of returned volunteers at all levels. Organizations doing emergency relief in Africa, such as the International Rescue Committee or Refugees International, are heavily staffed by returned volunteers, as are major companies involved in healthcare and HIV/AIDS prevention, like John Snow International and MSH, as are agencies focusing on education and small business development, like the Academy for Educational Development. The founder-president of AfriCare, C. Payne Lucas, who organized AfriCare. AfriCare is probably the single most important private development agency working in Africa, and C. Payne Lewis was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1960s in Niger and later regional director of the Peace Corps for Africa. And former volunteers are now leading non-government organizations seeking to influence U.S. policy on Africa, people like Leonard Robinson, who's the president of the National Summit on Africa, and Mel Foote, who's president of the Constituency for Africa. So, to conclude, I'm sure you're happy to hear that, U.S. involvement in Africa is very much a part of our efforts to cope with and shape global forces at work on the continent. Specifically, America is affected by exchange with Africa through immigration and trade, and by threats from Africa such as unfamiliar diseases or terrorism or the drug trade. Africa is playing a gradually increasing role in U.S. foreign policy, a role which the second Bush administration simply will have to face up to. The African states are important laboratories, or you might call them battlegrounds, for fundamental American values like open economies, democratization, and human rights. And American policymakers, whether they like it or not, get heavily engaged in conflict resolution in Africa because those conflicts, like the one in the Congo or in Sierra Leone, can trigger wider regional instability. They can draw in governments hostile to the United States, and they cost U.S. taxpayers billions of dollars. And finally, experience in the Peace Corps has had a major impact on the implementation of U.S. policy in Africa through USAID and the State Department, and through dozens of agencies and organizations working for improved education, health, small business development, and the relief of suffering on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. There's some time to take questions, and since this talk today is being taped, there is one little thing we have to notice. Before you ask, I have to hand you the microphone, and then please hand the microphone to the next person who is asking a question. So you're the first one.
What sort of grade would you give the Clinton administration's African policy? And do you think that the United States should play a peacekeeping role? And then finally, what's the relative importance of Europe versus the United States in terms of trying to establish some sort of stability?
I'll start with the third question. The Europeans have traditionally been more interested in Africa than the United States, mostly because of their colonial past. And it's also true that the European powers are spending a lot more money on aid to Africa than the United States is. The largest donors to Africa today are Japan and France. The United States is about fifth in the group. I think the Clinton administration needs to be given credit for trying to pull the American people into a greater concentration and interest in Africa. A lot of that was done through the media. A lot of it was symbolic, as I pointed out. But it really was a good faith effort, I think, by Clinton to show greater interest in the continent. The gravest constraint, I think, for U.S. policy, aside from the fears that were generated by the debacle in Somalia, is the lack of resources. I keep coming back to that. For example, there's been a tremendous amount of criticism for U.S. policy in Sierra Leone. Why didn't the U.S. do more to prevent this atrocious civil war in which the rebels, who seem to have no particular political objective except control of the areas where there were diamonds, were cutting off people's hands and legs with impunity? But the problem was not that we were unwilling to put U.S. troops into Sierra Leone. The problem was that the U.S. and the international community were unwilling to allocate the amount of resources to UN peacekeeping and African peacekeeping that might have done some good in that area. Or at least the development of a UN peacekeeping force came very late in the day, and even today is not fully deployed in the country. So the resource problem, I think, drives a lot of that. But there were failures, of course. At the time of the Clinton trip, we heard a great deal about a large educational initiative in Africa, which simply never took shape in the 2 years following the trip. So I would give them an A- at least for effort, maybe charitably a B-, C+ for effectiveness.
Should we be peacekeepers?
Well, I think there's a political reality there that we have to face, and I don't think it's necessary for us. I don't think it necessarily has to be the case that we put troops into Africa. Of course, then you ask, well, why are we willing to put troops in the Balkans and not in Africa? Does that have some kind of a racist background? But I think in most of these places, the U.S. can do more by contributing resources, particularly the UN for peacekeeping. There's been some positive development in the UN peacekeeping area, where a deal has now been worked out by which we pay most of our dues, and our assessment for peacekeeping has been reduced. And it really remains to be seen whether the Bush administration will now run with that ball with the UN, which could be very useful to peacekeeping in Africa in general. Another question?
I was wondering, how do you think the second Bush administration will deal with the low level of the U.S. government resources that are available to Africa?
Well, the new Secretary of State very early on said what we need is more resources, so hooray for him. But the question, of course, comes in the struggle within the administration, the struggle with the White House, with the Office of Management and Budget. And what we're told is that the Bush administration is going to spend more money on education and defense. We haven't heard anything about spending more money on foreign policy. So I'm pretty doubtful about that, at least based on what has happened so far. And there's no doubt that we're terribly underfunded in the whole international area.
Walking to the next question and answer.
Yes, I worked under Leonard Robinson and Bernadette Palo in the National Summit on Africa this summer, and their whole deal was to create a policy towards Africa by the American people, what we thought should be done. Do you feel that what they came up with is largely being thrown out, not only by the Clinton administration, but also the Bush administration?
Leonard and Bernadette are both friends of mine, and I respect a lot what they have done. I think that the most important achievement of the National Summit on Africa was to focus attention of Americans on Africa. I don't think the policy process works in quite the way that was envisaged with the National Summit on Africa. I don't think that a group of that sort, even though it meets in different cities around the United States, can come up with an agenda and then hand the agenda to the administration and say, do it. It doesn't really work that way. It's a much more complicated process of working through the Congress. In my experience, the specifics of those recommendations are not likely to be accepted by any administration in any wholesale way. But it's important that that large group of Americans who became involved in the National Summit on Africa continue to work in this area and continue to tell the politicians that Africa is important.
Do you think that a Marshall Plan style campaign by the United States and Europe could have chances of succeeding in Africa? And then also one other question. I was very surprised to hear no mention of the AIDS epidemic in Africa. I was reading recently where that it shows all the signs in the next 20 years, past, present, and future, of having as much devastation as World War II did in Europe, over 50 million dead. And then this ties into the Marshall Plan too, and the obligations of the United States and Europe. And I was wondering if you could comment on both of those questions.
Yeah, very good questions. First place, I would say, if you want to do something important, don't call it another Marshall Plan. That is a phrase that has been so overused that it's treated with great cynicism, I think, by policymakers in general. But the HIV/AIDS crisis is one which deserves its own campaign, and to give credit, there is increasing focus on that. But that's part of the resource problem. The Clinton administration has did give a lot more attention to HIV/AIDS during the last 2 years, and the relative amount of aid allocated to Africa focused on HIV/AIDS has increased a lot, but not nearly the level of what it should. The National Peace Corps Association this year has made its main advocacy issue the increase in funding of international health programs, specifically HIV/AIDS. There needs to be a vast increase in the amount allocated to aid, and also the Congress needs to eliminate some of the restrictions between different sectors of aid. The Congress is very fond of micromanaging the aid program, putting little restrictions here and there. And AIDS has such a cross-cutting effect on all the sectors in Africa that it's important to make sure that these funds can be used flexibly. The issue of drugs, for example, has become a major one, and we're really on the wrong side of that issue, I think. I was just listening the other day to an interesting NPR description of what Brazil is doing and how they are providing these AIDS drugs to their populations under grounds that there's a national emergency there which allows you to overlook patents. But we're apparently fighting Brazil on just this issue because the drug companies are insisting that patents be respected. We need to find a way to encourage U.S. firms to the maximum to provide these drugs and provide them at a cost that Africans can make use of them with. Otherwise, the epidemic will continue unchecked.